5. Fairies and Psychical Research. The fairy belief, we have said, is a composite thing, and the material is given by tradition such as a memory, perhaps of a prehistoric race by an old religion, and in the thoughts of the pre-Christian Hades, poetry, fancy have been at work. Consumption, lingering disease, unexplained disappearances, and sudden deaths have been accounted for by the agency of the fairies, or people of peace. If the superstitions included no more than this, we might regard it as a natural result of imagination, dealing with the facts quite natural in the ordinary course of things. But there are elements in the belief which cannot be so easily dismissed. We must ask whether the abnormal phenomena which have been so frequently discussed, fought over, forgotten, and revived, do not enter the general mass of folklore. They appear most notably in the two branches of browniedom, of pixies, as they say in Devonshire, who haunt the house, and in the alleged examples of the second sight. The former topic is the more obscure, if not the more curious. Let us examine the occurrences, then, which may have begotten the belief of brownies and that house-haunting pixies are fairies. These appearances may be alleged, on one hand, to be actual facts of nature, and the workings of some yet unexplained forces, or they may merely be the consequences of some very old traditional methods of imposture, vulgar in itself, but still historical. That form of imposture, again, may be wrought either by conscious agents or unconsciously and automatically by persons under the influence of somnambulism, or, finally, the phenomenon may be various cases be due to one of the three agencies, of all which may possibly be various cause, as consciously imposture and trickery in certain in vera causa. In Mr. Kirk's book we meet the invisible wights of the haunt houses, and throw great stones, pieces of earth and wood, and the inhabitants, but hurt them not at all. As we have said, Major, 1518, Halsey writes Fawny or Brobny, that is, brownies, and says that they thrash as much grain as one night as 20 men could do, and throw stones about. The legend of their working was common in Scotland, and the correspondence at Devonshire the belief of pixies who set the house in order exists among the grandparents of the present generation. But the sportive is more common than the kindly aspect of brownies. Through history we consistently find them causing objects to move without visible contact, and acting in sport like buffoons and trolls. In his Letters on Demonology, page 377, Scott gives instances where the buffoon or troll was detected, and confessed that the rattlings of plates and movements of objects were caused by an apparatus of threads and horsehair. He also quotes the famous doings of the Just Devil of Woodstock in 1649, which so perplexed and discomfited the Cromwellian commissioners. He accounts for the annoyances of confessions of Joe Collins of Oxford. Funny Joe, while he quotes from Hone's Everyday Book, while Hone quotes from the British Magazine of 1747. But the writer in the British Magazine gives no references or authorities of the authenticity of Funny Joe's confessions, nor even of the existence of Joseph. Scott could not find his original on the pamphlets of the British Museum, and some of the statements attributed to Joe could not tally to the official account and other contemporary documents collected in Sir Walter's Woodstock. Joe pretends, for example, to have been secretary to the commission under the name of Giles Sharp, but in the other accounts his secretary is named Brown. The royalist brownie, or poltergeist, lies under shrewd suspicion, but Joe's own existence is unproved, and his alleged evidence is of no value. However, no sane person can dream of doubting that many a brownie has been as much flesh and blood as a brownie of Bedson in Hogg's story. There remains the less easily explicable tales of strange and humorous disturbances, accompanied by loud sounds, rappings, and moving of objects without any visible contact, and so forth. Perhaps we may best examine these by taking modern instances collected by the Psychical Society in the first place, and then comparing them to the cases recorded at distant times and remote places. Some curious common features will be observed, and the evidence has at least the value of undesigned coincidence. Glanville Telfar, minister of rhetoric, and the Wesleys, Dr. Adam Clark and Priest Mather, were not modern students of psychical research. The modern psychical researchers, we fear, are not students of the old legendary lore, which they dismiss on evidence not first-handed or scientifically valid. Thus, they do not seem to be aware that they're describing almost identical terms, phenomena identical with the notes of Telfar, Mather, Lavatar, and the rest, by those ancients attributed to devils. The modern recorders are not consciously copying from the old accounts. The coincidences, therefore, have value as proving that certain phenomena have occurred and recurred. Now, those phenomena may be due to conscious or to hysterical imposture, but they have been frequent and common enough to keep alive, and probably originates the part of the fairy belief, that part which concerned the brownies and the house-haunting pixies who draw movies. These again correspond to the tricky beings described by Mr. Leland in the Etruscan Remains as survivals of the Roman and Etruscan popular beliefs. We find similar occurrences in the empire of the Incas, not long after the Spanish conquered Peru. Beginning, then, with what is nearest to us in the times, we take Mr. F. W. H. Myers' essays on alleged movement of objects without contact, occurring not in the presence of a paid medium. The alleged phenomena are, of course, as common as blackberries in the presence of paid mediums, but are to the last degree untrustworthy. Even when there is no paid medium present, the mere contagious excitement which is said to have been developed at seances makes all as though to occur there was a store to be taken with plenty of salt. One of Mr. Myers' examples was the result of seances, but it had features of great importance for this argument. It will be found in SPR Volume 19, page 189, July 1891. The performers are Mr. C, Mrs. C, and Mr. H. Mr. C and Mrs. C are spoken of as good witnesses, known to Mr. Myers and Professor Barrett. Mr. H's health has suffered so much that he cannot be examined, and Mr. H is a person who interests us here for reasons which will be given later. All three were unbelievers in these matters. On the second evening, lights floated about the room, which was lit, apparently, by a full moon. F, who is also H, felt cold hands touching, and hands recur in old pre-scientific accounts. The three majors were holding hands tightly at the time. Now, Mr. H had hitherto been in excellent health, but after his chair was dragged from under him and he was thrown down on the ground, he went into a trance. His watch and ring, on the middle of his hand held by Mrs. C, were carried to a remote part of the room. H leaves the circle and sits at the window. Another figure walks through the room. H returns and is thrown down. His coat is dragged off, and his boots are discovered on a distant sofa. He asks for something from home and goes into a trance. A photograph locked up by him at home is found on the table. His wife, in town, being quite ignorant of our having seances, told us that at the very hour a fearful crash occurred in his bedroom. The photograph vanished and returned last night when H was in the trance. He is thrown down again. He has alternate fits of unconsciousness and raving delirium. The home of Mr. and Mrs. C, not the house where they sat, is vexed by figures, noises, and knockings. We were sprinkled with water in the night, haunted by sounds of drums and horns, and so forth. Before a manifestation, we all felt a sudden chill, like either a wave of intensely cold air passing or a rapid decrease of temperature. This is a disgusting story if Mr. H's health was ruined by the presence at the performances. The point, however, is that he did behave in epileptic fashion while these events were in progress. It is natural to suppose that in his trances he may have been capable, unconsciously, of feats physically and morally impossible to him in his normal condition. This explanation would not cover all the alleged occurrences, but would account for many of them. We now take an ancient instance, similar to the disturbances in Newbury, New England, in 1679, similarly accompanied by the presence of an epileptic patient. The house of William Morse was strangely disquieted by a demon. The inmates were Morse, his wife, and their grandson, the boys whose age was not given. The trouble began on December 3rd with the sound of heavy objects falling on the roof. On December 8th, large stones and bricks were thrown in the west end of the house. The bedstead was lifted up from the floor, and the bedstaff flung out of the window, and a cat was hurled at the wife. A long staff danced up and down in the chimney. The man's wife put the staff in the fire, but she could not hold it there, inasmuch as it would be forcibly fly out of it. Yet after much ado, with joint strength, they made it burn. A chair flew about, and at last lighted on the table, where victuals stood ready to eat, and was likely to spoil all. Only by a nimble catching they saved some of their meat. A chest was removed from place to place, and with no hand touching it. 2 keys would fly about, making a loud noise by knocking against each other. As they lay in the bed, their little boy between them, a great stone on the floor was in the loft was thrown upon the man's stomach, and turning it down upon the floor, it was once more thrown up upon him. On January 23rd, 1680, his inkhorn was taken away from him while he was writing. He was keeping a diary of these events, and when all was seeking, he could not find it, and at last he saw it drop out of the air, down by the fire. February 2nd, while he and his boy were eating cheese, the pieces which were cut rested from them. But as for the boy, he was a great sufferer of these afflictions, for on the 18th of December, he, sitting by his grandfather, was hurried into great motions. The man made him stand between his legs, but the chair danced up and down, and was like to have cast both man and boy into the fire, and the child was tossed about in such a manner as they had feared his brains would have been beaten out. All of these contortions of the boy were apparently what M. Charcot calls clownisms. When taken to the doctor's house, the boy was free of disturbances, which returned with his return home. He barked like a dog, clucked like a hen, talked nonsense about Powell, who pinched and bullied him. While he was in his bed with the old people, a pot with its contents were thrown upon them. While they clutched hands, like Mr. and Mrs. C., once a voice was heard singing, "Revenge, revenge is sweet." Finally, a mate of a ship came and declared that the grandmother was not rightly suspected of witch, and offered, if he were left alone with the boy, to cure him. The mate came next day betimes, and the boy was with him till night, since which time in his house Morse saith has not been molested with evil spirits. Probably the mate used the ropes in, and the boy was more speedily cured than Mr. H. Phenomena of these droll or buffooning rites, as Mr. Kirk says, and no man can doubt that the boy was at the bottom of the whole affair. But whether he was capable, when well or conscious, of other diversions, is another question. Children like him produced the famous witch mania in New England. We have here, undeniably, a well-recorded case, analogous to that of Mr. H. In modern case of bell-ringing, heavy thumps, and movement of objects, the agent was a young girl who had never been out to service before, and who passed the night in a state of wildly agitated somnambulism, repeated the whole service of the day. Mather gives several other examples in which motives or trickery are manifest, while we hear nothing of an apathetic or hysterical patient. In the majority of instances, ancient or modern, children are the agents. Thus we have psychical phenomena attained in a family circle, that of Mr. and Mrs. Davis with their children at Rio de Janeiro. The time was 1888. Curiosity has been caused by the notorious Henry Slade. There were touches and grasps of hands. A table ran after me, from Professor Alexander, and attempted to hem me in, when only C, a little girl, was in the room. As far as I could see, she did not even touch the table. The chair of Amy, aged 13 months, was moved about like that of a Master Morse 200 years earlier. The table jumped into the laps of the public. There were raps and thumps which seemed to shake the whole building. The lights floated about. A slate covered with flour was placed on C's lap. Her hands lay on the table. Marks of her fingers came on the floor, and, in answer to the mark of a naked baby foot. The present children were wearing laced boots, and were not told that little Amy was under the table. Bluish lights and the phantasm of a dog were seen. All of this answers to an ancient example of disturbances in Mr. Wesley's house in Epsworth, December 1715 to January 1716. The house was a new one, rebuilt in 1709. We have Samuel Wesley's journal, with many contemporary letters from members of the family and later reminiscences. There were many lively girls in the house, and 2 servants, a maid and a man, recently engaged. The disturbances began with groanings, then came knockings which flitted about the house. Mr. Wesley heard nothing till December 21st. The knocks replied to those made by the family, but they never could imitate the sounds. Mr. Wheely and Emily saw an object like a badger run from under the bed and vanish. The mastiff was much alarmed by the sounds. Mr. Wheely was thrice pushed by invisible power. The bogey was a Jacobite, as was Mrs. Wesley. Mr. Wesley was from King George. The knocks were violent when that usurper was prayed for. They did not try praying for King James. Robin, the servant, saw a handmill work violently. Not vexed me, but that it was empty. I thought it had been full of malt. He might have ground his heart out for me. But this was a jocose, not an industrious devil. Robin called it Old Jeffreys, after a gentleman lately dead. The family called it Geoffrey, unless one name was merely misspelling. It seemed to sweep after Nancy Wesley when she swept the chambers. She thought he had done it for her, and saved her the trouble. Mrs. Wesley concealed the letter from her husband, lest he should fancy it was against his own death. Letter of January 12th, 1716 to 17. This belief in noises foretelling death is very common. Compare Scott's nocturnal disturbances at Abbotsford and Bulwark, whose agents in building it and dying in London. The racket occurred on April 28th and 29th, 1818, and Scott examined the scene with Beardy's broadsword under my arm. Bullock died in Tenderton Street, in London. Whether on April 28th or 29th is not easily ascertained. The noise resembled half a dozen men putting up boards and furniture. Nothing could be more certain that there was nobody on the premises at the time. The noises used to follow Hetty Wesley and thump her under her feet, and under those we see in Professor Alexander's narrative. Mr. Wesley's plate danced before him on the table a pretty while without anybody stirring the table. The disturbances quieted down in January, but recurred on March 31st. Similar phenomena had occurred long before in the family. The sound very often seemed in the air, in the middle of the room, nor could they ever make any such themselves with any contrivance. On February 16th, 1740, 23 years later, Emily writes to Jack about the wonderful thing called us, Geoffrey, that something calls me against my extraordinary new affliction. Priestley styles this affair, the Beth authenticated that anywhere extant. He supposes that it might have been a trick for the servants for mere amusement. The modus operandi is difficult to explain. We hear nothing of bad health or hysterics in the household. For our purpose, it is enough to know that a few incidents of this kind, however produced, might originate and keep alive the belief in brownies, and that shrewd and knavish sprite called Robin Goodfellow, who frights the maidens of the villagery, skims milk, and sometimes labors on the quern. By a curious coincidence, we can show a case in which the phenomena of this kind is usually reported occurring at seances, and in examples of William Morris, were actually accepted as manifestations of the Slad Myth, or Fairies. In his account of the disturbances in the Wesley family, Dr. Clark, the author, averred that he had himself witnessed similar events. It is thus he became to consult the Life, London, 1833. In the history of my own life, says Dr. Clark, I have related this matter in sufficient detail. Unluckily, in his Life, page 76 to 77, He gives scarce any details. Previous to the sudden deaths in a family called church, the phenomena of falling plates, heavy tread, and other noises occurred. Mr. Clark sat up one night in the kitchen and almost distinctly heard the noises above. He was born mystic, and even in childhood a reader of Cornelius Agrippa, and later of the alchemists. But he recorded the instance of a woman who solemnly declared to Mrs. Clark that a number of the gentle people, Slamite, occasionally frequented her house, that they often conversed with her, one of them putting its hands on her eyes during the time, which hands she represented, from the sensation she had, to be of the size of those of a child of 4 or 5 years of age. The family were worn down with these visits, and from the mention of touches and hands it is pretty plain that we have to do with the kind of sprite whose paws people at seances. But these sprites are recognized, as seen in North Ireland, as gentle people, folk of the peace. The amusing thing is that Mr. Clark, while he believes in Mr. Wesley's Geoffrey and the supernatural origin of a noise in the kitchen, laughs at similar phenomena when assigned to fairies. It is mere differences of terminology. Another old example may be given. It is Alexander Telfair's true relation of disturbances at Ringcroft in the parish of Redrick. The story is attested by the signatures of Ewart, ministers of Kells and Galway, Monteith, minister of Borg, Murdoch, minister of Crossmichael, and Loch Ken, Spalding, minister at Parton, also by Loch Ken, Falconer, minister at Kelton, Mr. McLeland of Colleen, Lennox of Millhouse, and a number of farmers. These were all neighbors, and all attested that they saw and heard. Robert Chambers says, there never, perhaps, was any mystic history better attested. A few narrations of a kind have included occurrences and appearances which it was more difficult to reconcile with the theory of trick or imposture. Mr. Telfair himself had been chaplain in 1687 to Sir Thomas Kirkpatrick of Closeburn. He was then an Episcopalian. Andrew Mackey was a stonemason at Rarick. On March 7th, 1695, and for long after, stones began to fly about his house by night and day. The stones which hit any person had not half their natural weight. Mackey complained to Telfair, the minister, who entered the house and prayed. Nothing odd occurred. As he stood outside, he saw 2 little stones drop down on the croft, and then he was asked to return, and was pelted inside the cottage. This was March 11th. For a week there was no more trouble than the disturbances began again. Mr. Telfair was sent for, and was pelted, beaten with a staff, and heard loud knockings. That night I was in prayer, leaning upon the bedside. I felt something lifting up my arm. I, casting my eyes there, perceived a little white hand and arm of the elbow down, but presently vanished. There was never anything seen except that hand I saw, and the apparition of a boy in grey clothes. Sometimes the stoning went on in the open air. There were plenty of touchings, grippings, and scratchings. The door bar, a long heavy piece of squared wood, would go through the house as if a person were carrying it in their hand, yet nothing seen doing it. Here we compare in Proc. S.P.R. February 1892 the story of the carpenter's shop in Swanland, in Yorkshire, where pieces of wood were levitated into abnormal flight. No imposture was discovered, nor was the presence of any one person necessary. The ministers of Kells and Crossmichael were pelted with stones of 8 pounds weight. On April 6th, a fireball was floated through the cottage. When 5 ministers were present, it made all the house shake, break a hole through the thatch, and poured in great stones. They handed the legs of some as a man's hand. They hoisted Mr. Telfair, Lennox of Millhouse, and others off the ground. A sieve flew through the house. Mackey caught it, and a force gripped it and pulled the interior apart from the rim. A day of humiliation was solemnly kept in the parish, which only excited the emotion of the disturbing agent. It continued in a most fearful manner without intermission. Voices were heard, which talked nonsense of a semi-scriptural kind. Finally the thing died out in the early of May. By the way, on April 28th, it pulled down the end of the house, all the stonework thereof. This is a very odd case, as no suspicion is thrown on the children. The attestations of several witnesses are given, not only at the close, but at almost every separate incident. The vision of the white hand is agreeable. The Devil of Glenluce, Galloway, was published by Sinclair in his Hydrostatics, of all places, in 1672, and again in Satan's Invisible World, and by Glenville in Sedemicus Triumphatus. In this affair, a boy called Thomas, the son of an unlucky householder, was clearly the agent. The phenomena were stone-throwing, beating with sticks, levitation of a plate, and a great deal of voices, possibly uttered the aforesaid Thomas. The Synod ordered a day of humiliation, 1655-56. The affair of the drummer of Tedworth, 1661, is, or ought to be, too well known for quotation. The troubles began when Mr. Mompesson seized the drum of a vagrant musician. In the presence of a clergyman, chairs walked about the room themselves. A bedstaff was thrown at the minister, and so favorably that a lock of wool could not have fallen more softly. The children, as usual, were especially haunted. The jingling of money was common, it is also as Epworth. Lights wandered about the house, blue and glimmering, and the noise was persistent in the woodwork of the children's beds while their hands were outside. The knocks answered knocks made by visitors. There were drivers and other marvels. The drummer was suspected, but, consciously or not, the children were probably the agents. They seemed to have been at their usual health. Galashel's, date not given, a loud knock on the floor, accompanied by a hysteroepileptic girl wherever she sat. In bed, her body was so lifted up that many strong men were not able to keep it down. The minister, who could not make anything of her, was Mr. Wilkie. The girl was Margaret Wilson, Sinclair, page 200. This little parcel of strange stories may suffice to show that the part of the fairy belief is based on such incidents as still occur, or are reported to occur, just in the old fashion. It is for the psychologists and physicians to ascertain how far, if at all, the incidents are produced by hysterical or epileptic or somnambulistic patients. Common Fort Worth trickery is usually detected in paid mediums. If the trickery simulates real events, or continues an old traditional form of imposture, the moral that parents should not allow their children to be present at seances hardly needs enforcing. Some of them may escape unharmed, but frightful injuries may be inflicted on the health and on character.